Yes. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1 is done, and I do want to apologize for the semi-clickbait nature of the thumbnail. Obviously, it's unfair to compare one season of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms to 8 seasons of Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon in process. However, we're going to do it anyway. No. It just occurred to me that a lot of the reasons why A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms succeeded were also some of the reasons why Game of Thrones in particular struggled, and in particular the last, 4 seasons of the show. And yes, it is easy to simply come to the conclusion that, HBO should do a better job of listening to George Martin and trying to do faithful adaptations of his material because it's really good. However, I think everyone's figured that out by now, so I wanted to go beyond that a little bit and talk about what that means and just how A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms pulled that off. I boiled it down to 5 things. Number 1, the show had a clear and consistent idea of who the characters are. Number 2, the story gave the protagonists many different kinds of challenges to overcome. Number 3, goodness is actually rewarded, even in the grim dark world of Westeros. Number 4, an excellent implementation of the roads not taken technique, which is one of my favorite George Martin writing techniques. And number 5, of course, the archetypes and symbols were crackin'. They were crack-a-lackin'. And speaking of symbols, yes, this is my representation of a hedge knight. It's a hedge and a knight. In any case, I will still have that big Most Rebellious Baratheons video coming early next week. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you like this sort of thing. And you might even do me a solid and click that thumbs up button while the intro music plays. And we'll commence our review of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms Season 1. All right, the first way that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms succeeded is definitely one in which Game of Thrones struggled, and that is having a clear and consistent idea of who the characters are. Character consistency, in my opinion, is the number one thing that actually creates audience immersion. The world itself can be totally alien to us, like medieval Westeros or SpongeBob SquarePants Under the Sea. But if the characters are consistent and if the way they're reacting to what's happening makes sense, then we will essentially buy into the story. So let's start with Dunk. As much as we would sort of want Dunk to take Maekar's offer to go live at Summerhall and, have showers and stuff, it does make sense for Dunk to refuse the offer and to be generally slow to trust the High Lords. Dunk is obviously the hero of the story, but they didn't try to make him gray or troubled in some unnatural way. He already has a little bit of moral ambiguity due to the fact that he, lied about being knighted to get into the tourney. And I do still see some people running around saying that, they shouldn't have made this clear because it's ambiguous in the books. It's really not. For example, after Egg's lie is exposed and he reveals himself as a Targaryen to Dunk, Dunk thinks to himself, he knew what it was like to want something so badly that you would tell a monstrous lie just to get near it. So yeah, he's talking about lying about being knighted. And so yeah, that works. That makes him interesting. And another thing that makes Dunk interesting is the fact that he is kind of limited. He's inexperienced. He's not good with his words. He's barely trained, really, as a knight at all. He's never been in a joust before. He's never been in actual combat before. And the story doesn't grant Dunk some sort of sudden expertise. We didn't get the training montage and then all of a sudden he's got the Mary Sue powers. Dunk has to blunder his way through, making mistakes and getting almost killed. Honestly, I don't know how he didn't die. And the point is, these limitations create conflict and tension. So they didn't have to add some sort of artificial character drama to do that, which is quite often what you see. Contrived drama just to inject tension into a story. So then we have Dunk, somewhat preposterously, asking Prince Maekar Targaryen to send one of his royal sons on the road to live that hedge knight life with Dunk. It's an audacious ask, but it makes sense because we know that Dunk romanticizes hedge knight life as this way to create a virtuous person and a good knight. This in turn makes sense because we know that Sir Arlen romanticized the hedge knight life. And because when Dunk did show up to the tourney and start rubbing elbows with the High Lords, it was kind of a shit show. Maekar's sons, in particular, reflect the sort of spoiling effect of wealth and privilege. And so, yeah, Dunk sees that and says, hey, Maekar, maybe the hedge knight life is actually the way to raise a good prince. And again, there's a plot echo here to the way that Varys and Illyrio tried to engineer Fagon as a good prince by having him do humble tasks and live amongst the common people, etc., etc. So then we have the betrayal of the story, which comes from Sir Stephen Fossaway, and he made a lot of sense as a betrayer. So the expectations were subverted here when he briefly and falsely offered to help Dunk, but his betrayal made perfect sense once it happened. So it didn't come out of nowhere, it was well set up, and then it in turn set up the hero moments for Raymond Fossaway and then Baylor Breakspear. Then we have Makar's decision-making, which I got into in a video earlier this week, thanks for watching. And it does make sense that Makar backed his son Arion, even when Arion is obviously obnoxious and in the wrong, both because Arion is Makar's eldest son, but more so because they share a ruling philosophy. They believe in ruling through intimidation and a little bit of Targaryen supremacy. The blood of the dragon does not sleep in a ditch. Then we have the dramatic moment when Baelor rides onto the field and takes Dunk's side to give him 7 and give him a fighting chance. And even though this was a surprise in the moment, at least if you haven't, read the books, it's a surprise the first time you read it in the books too. But again, it makes sense. It clicks into place like, oh yeah, okay, of course he would do that because Baelor has been set up as an honorable person. And so the point is, your surprising plot twists shouldn't come out of nowhere. They should make sense once they happen. Kind of like the Red Wedding. It was a surprise, but you looked back on it and like, oh yeah, okay, there was a lot of foreshadowing for it. They were talking about Walder Frey, like, you can't trust that guy. And the direwolf was really, really pissed at the Freys and didn't want to go inside. So yeah, that all made sense once it happened. Similarly, the big moon meteor apocalypse that's definitely coming at the end of the Winds of Winter to cause a new long night will come out of nowhere, so to speak, for some people. But even if you've never heard my theories or watched my channel, you could then go back through the books and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff about bleeding stars and these legends about the moon cracking and so on and so forth. And then they'll be able to say, oh yeah, okay, this does make sense. It didn't come totally out of nowhere. So getting back to A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, how do we start talking about moon meteors? Even some of the minor characters make a lot of sense and reflect the themes of the story. So take Rowan, aka Red, the sex worker. In the first episode, they created a parallel between her and Dunk because she compared her line of work to being a hedge knight by saying, hey, we're both risking our bodies for the amusement of the High Lords. Then in the last episode, we see that she's had this rise to power, which also parallels Dunk's almost rise to power. So Rowan essentially attached herself to one of the good nobles, to an honorable noble, one of the few that you can find, which would be Raymond Fossaway. And that's very similar to what Dunk was trying to do when he dropped to one knee and was about to swear to serve Baelor Breakspear. That's a good way to navigate the world of Westeros. When you find an honorable person, swear yourself into their service or marry them. So that's a really cool parallel, again, between one of the major characters and one of the minor characters. And you can only do that sort of stuff if you understand the themes of the story and the characters. Themes aren't just for book reports, they're for all stories, in fact. And it's really hard not to be snarky. I will try to turn it down, but why would they even say that? Themes are for book reports? No, themes are for stories. I didn't turn it down. Okay, moving along to comparisons with Game of Thrones. Okay, I'm really gonna have to try hard here. So in Game of Thrones, a lot of the main characters suddenly became different people, right? So Daenerys, who had basically been protecting the innocent for 7 seasons and 3 episodes, she just went north to risk everything she had to save the Northmen instead of fighting the White Walkers. Once they got south, she suddenly decides to slaughter thousands of innocent, hundreds at least, innocent civilians in a rage after she had basically just won the battle. I did make a whole video about that if you want more of that. Then we have Tyrion, and of course Alt Shift X with the great Who is the Real Tyrion video that most of you have probably watched. Tyrion's character is very clearly trending towards villainy, and George Martin refers to him as a villain. And he was trending that way on the show too, until suddenly he got whitewashed in the final seasons. Like, one of the defining things about Tyrion is that he hates the people of King's Landing. After that whole trial thing, he saved them and they weren't grateful and they call him monkey demon and stuff. So yeah, he hates the people of King's Landing, but suddenly he's the good angel on Dany's shoulder. Similarly, Tyrion, very well defined by hating his family, especially Cersei. But then he's arguing for peace, arguing on behalf of Cersei and Jaime, really, to Dany. And then we have Jon, who is in fact ambitious. Oh, don't want it. Yes, he does. He is ambitious. He's hot-tempered. He's passionate. But in the last couple seasons of the show, he basically became an empty vessel with hardly any lines and no passion. I mean, he used to say stuff. Even in like season 6, he's doing several sentences in a row. It just stopped. Bran's arc in the books is fundamentally magical and mythical, and the showrunners basically didn't want anything to do with that, so they didn't know what to do with Bran, and so his whole climax just didn't make any sense at all. And then we have Cersei, who obviously Lena Headey, was tremendous as Cersei, but the last season she basically just stood around and did jack squat. And as many people have commented, giving Jaime and Cersei this sort of tragic romantic ending really didn't make sense, especially on the Jaime side of it. He basically just went backwards and reverted to his original character, as if all of his growth with Brienne had never happened, as if his entire character arc had never happened. All right, so the next reason why A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms succeeded was that it gave the hero, Dunk, and Egg also, but mainly Dunk, a lot of different kinds of challenges. Dunk obviously has the physical challenge of the trial by 7, which again, he barely made it through. Dunk also has the sort of spiritual challenge of finding courage to face the overwhelming odds that he's stacked up against. He didn't flee the tourney, and don't forget that he has those very understandable panic attacks sometimes. Imagine if you were wrapped in metal and shoved out onto the tourney field to fight for your life. Dunk also has to overcome his imposter syndrome, which again is tied to the idea that he wasn't really knighted. But even putting that aside, he's just never jousted before and is very out of his element. So that's something everyone can relate to, imposter syndrome. And then, like I mentioned, Dunk isn't good with his words, and yet the moment calls for him to give a speech. And he gave a great speech, and shout out to Peter Claffey for obviously nailing that. He even continued on and regained the momentum after Lord Bracken's fart. And then turning to some more subtle stuff, Dunk also has to forgive Egg and decide not to just go it alone again. So he's paying forward some of Arlen's care and deciding that he's not going to leave Egg to be raised by all the, corrupt Targaryens at Summerhall or King's Landing or wherever. Similarly, Dunk is starting to learn not to necessarily judge every High Lord as being corrupt and all the same. He's starting to learn politics and how to read people. Like, he's still friends with Lionel, but he was smart enough not to necessarily just sign himself over to Lionel's whim. And he also threaded the needle of finding a way to take Aegon as his squire without signing over everything to Maekar. So yeah, those were a couple of interesting obstacles that he had to navigate. And then there were some even smaller things like, he doesn't have enough money to buy armor and has to sell Sweetfoot. And the show really nailed it by taking the whole idea that, Dunk bought Sweetfoot an apple when he sold him. He gave the groom an extra penny to give Sweetfoot an apple. And then the show invented an ending for Sweetfoot that wasn't in the books, which played on that because now he's going to be in the orchard with the Fossaways eating all the apples he wants. So that's very nice attention to detail. Side point. Another obstacle Dunk has to overcome, he doesn't have a sponsor. So he keeps searching, he doesn't give up, and he keeps searching until he goes all the way up the ladder to Baelor Breakspear himself, the Crown Prince. And then finally, when he receives the news of the trial by combat, he needs 6 people to fight for him, and he doesn't know where those are going to come from. And that brings us to our next reason why A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms resonated with all of us, and that would be because goodness is rewarded. So like I said, Dunk doesn't have any allies at first, but the goodness that he's already shown has already won over Rhaemond Fossaway and Lionel Baratheon, and Dunk's loyalty to Egg comes back around because it was Egg who went and recruited everyone, or at least the first 4 people, to come and fight with Dunk. So this is really important, and it's consistent with how George writes, I believe. Even in a dark and terrible feudal medieval hellscape, goodness should still count. It makes a difference. And this is basically the Ned Stark lesson. He gets his head chopped off. He's not rewarded for his goodness, but it does make a difference. All of his kids have What Would Ned Do wristbands, and people in the north are still standing up to go march through a snowstorm to retake Winterfell and rescue the Ned's little girl because of the example that Ned set. So even when Dunk is sitting in prison with seemingly no options and no help, he's already planted these seeds which will sprout into the form of 6 people that will help him defend his life. And so there's this quote from George about his heroes. I'll put it up on the screen, but basically he's talking about his heroes are the people who struggle against overwhelming odds to make the world better, and even if they don't succeed, it's the trying that makes them heroic. And basically, the kind of story that George likes to tell is one where the hero is facing overwhelming odds, but still is determined to stand on their principles and do the right thing. And the darker the world, the more terrible the circumstance, the more the good deed stands out and resonates as an example for others. Meanwhile, on the Game of Thrones show, Dany's hero arc was subverted, and it was instead used to drive home a cynical, nihilistic message, which I believe is fundamentally inconsistent with George's writing. And that message would be that, the person who tries hardest to make the world better by actually fighting injustice is probably just going to turn into an unjust, cruel tyrant themselves, because nobody can ever fix anything or do anything right. And this, in turn, leads to the climax of Jon's goodness and morality arc, being that he's the one who stands up to murder Dany, the cruel tyrant. And that's why it left everyone with such a bad taste. And we don't like what Jon did, and we don't like what happened to Dany. It basically ruined both of their characters. Another way that goodness didn't seem to matter on Game of Thrones is when Dany went north to fight the others in the north and save the Northmen. That didn't seem to count for anything among the Northmen or among the Starks, like Sansa and Arya. Like, that's absolutely insane. They would have been totally screwed without Dany and her dragons and her army. So it just seems a lot more realistic that, they'd be grateful. But of course, the show was already trying to set up this sort of artificial Dany villain arc, and so they made everyone in the North suspicious of her, and yeah, it didn't make sense, and the goodness went for nothing. Then we have Brienne's goodness, which essentially transformed Jaime's character throughout several books by setting this example for Jaime and showing him that, yes, you can be an honorable knight. That was essentially thrown in the trash as Jaime reverted to simping for Cersei. And then we have a couple of characters who should have been reflecting more darkness, but instead they had goodness sort of magically bestowed onto them. Tyrion is definitely the most obvious example of that, but consider Arya. We just sent a 10-year-old to the Faceless Man death cult, and then she comes back to Westeros and starts murdering people, but is also totally normal and not disturbed at all. That doesn't make any sense. Like, that's supposed to be a tragic element of her story, not just, oh, cool, she's a badass now. Like, no, we took a 10-year-old, 11-year-old child and turned her into an assassin after, like, all of her family died or she believed they were dead. All right, the fourth reason why the show was so good, this is really about the Hedge Knight story itself. And like I said, this is one of George's very best writing techniques. I love talking about this, the roads not taken technique. So when the show begins, when the Hedge Knight begins, we're set up to think that the whole challenge is about Dunk finding a way to enter the tourney, who he's going to joust with, how he's going to get the armor and a sponsor. He's watching the other jousters and thinking about who he's going to challenge. But then, the Aerion Tanzel incident happens and essentially wipes all of that away to reveal the real story, the real challenge. Dunk now has to fight for his life against the Kingsguard and a bunch of Targaryens to prove that what he did was right. This, in turn, becomes a test for the entire system. Is there justice in the land? Are there true knights anywhere? Are there any true knights among you? So previously, meaning before the twist, Dunk is kind of this curiosity to the High Lords because he's tall and kind of simple. Or ignorant, we'll say. He's a country bumpkin. And that extreme class divide kind of made it seem like there were two separate plots. There's the High Lord plot, and then there's Dunk and the common people scurrying around. But after the twist, Dunk is thoroughly entangled with the story of Baelor, Maekar, Aerion, Egg, who we now know is a prince. And so these two classes, which seemed so separate, now they've collided, and it's a big train wreck. They're all tangled up. And now we see that these High Lords, who maybe thought they were above everything, no, they see that the small folk do matter. And the entire story, in a believable way, comes to center on Dunk himself. So that was the major road not taken, setting up the whole tourney joust and then turning it into a conflict with the prince. But there were a bunch of others too, such as Baelor Breakspear. He was going to be the greatest king. His son Valar was saying, he was going to be the greatest king since Aegon the Conqueror, or maybe Jaehaerys, and quite possibly so. And because they made us feel that, we feel the loss of Baelor's death, the loss of this road not taken. Now, at the beginning of the story, Dunk was talking about potentially taking service with the High Lord and rising high, maybe even to the rank of Kingsguard. Maybe he'd even take service with House Targaryen. Remember when he said that in the inn in like episode 2 or 3? So by the end of the story, he's offered that. Maekar offers come to Summer Hall and we'll finish your training. It sounds like a good deal. And there's definitely part of us that wants Dunk to take the deal. Again, get to shower every day. There's lots of perks. But Dunk ultimately decides to forego that and hit the road and stick to that hedge knight life because, again, that is more true to his character. And I love that the show closes with him literally taking a different path. And then there's Arlen taking yet a third path into the Elysian fields and the afterlife. Another road not taken would be Egg staying with his messed up family. Like if you remember Daron saying, oh yeah, we'll make a man of Egg, meaning a monster. And we've seen that Egg does have a bit of a dark side. They added in that scene with the knife and Arion, but that's very consistent with other little signs that we've seen from Egg in the books. So yeah, if Egg was left with his family, he may have turned out to be a bad Egg. But instead, Dunk changes his mind at the end and decides to take Egg on as his squire. And then finally, the last road not taken that I saw, let me know if there's more. They made us think that we were building towards a Dunk-Tanzel romance. But instead, that plot thread mainly served to pull Dunk into this moment where he's got to make the snap decision to stand up to Arion or not. So even though Dunk and Tanzel didn't get to do any kissing or that kind of romantic stuff, Dunk did perform the chivalric role of saving the princess from the dragon. And of course, Tanzel in the puppet show was able to escape, and God knows what would have happened to her otherwise. Dunk basically stepped in and took all of the wrath that Arion had on himself so that, they didn't notice the puppeteers slipping away. So in the end, Dunk did save the princess. All right, the fifth and final reason why the show was so good was because of the archetypes and symbols. And the thing about archetypes and symbols, they're not just for us, myth heads and nerds. They work on everyone in the audience, even if people aren't thinking about them consciously. That's why they are so effective as storytelling techniques. When you use archetypes and symbols that resonate deep in the human psyche, it really just makes the characters pop. Such as Lionel Baratheon, the Laughing Storm, is the obvious example. Basically, Bacchus, Cernunnos, Dionysius, ridden onto the screen. He's horny and he's drinking and dancing and flirting and maybe going to war a little bit. And of course, George's version of this archetype also incorporates the storm god, the wrathful Baratheon. Again, next week, most rebellious Baratheon video coming out, 58 minutes of war and rebellion. And so yeah, Lionel pops, we get him intuitively, right away. We know what he's about. Then we have Dunk and Arlen, our heroic fool knights, with that foolish knight archetype being explained and built up and echoed by the puppet show, by Serwyn of the Mirror Shield and Florian the Fool. So again, themes. You have to understand the themes in order to really make all this work. And then we have the manifestation of the gods of the seven. And that's actually supposed to be the whole point of the trial by seven, is that it is a way for the gods to manifest their will on the earth. And so let's go through them. The father, Baelor, was the father figure of the story. Robin Risling, of course, was the warrior, and it was a very Odin-inspired version of the warrior. Steely Pate, obviously the smith, who is representing all craftsmen and workers. Then we have the crone, the fortune teller crone, obviously, who may have been Bloodraven in a glamour. She did have that red mark on her cheek. I wish I had noticed that earlier, but yeah, that might have been meant to be a little Bloodraven keeping an eye on things. The maiden was, of course, Lady Gwyn Ashford. Loved that scene at the end with her sort of apologizing to Dunk. That was cool. Another example of the show, using the side characters very skillfully. Then we have the stranger, who is kind of faceless and invisible and just lurking on the battlefield for the dead. But Dunk is also kind of the stranger. He is literally a stranger. He's a wanderer from far places, and he has come as a test and a judgment of the High Lords. And by the end of that combat, he is become Death, Destroyer of Worlds. Just look at him. And then the one we couldn't find, us in the chat and on the Discord, which you can get access to by becoming a YouTube channel member Squisher or signing up for our Patreon. We've all been talking about, where's the mother? Well, she showed up in the last episode. It was Rowan Fossaway, who is now pregnant with a Fossaway child. It doesn't matter. Guys, it doesn't matter. She's the mother. She's going to take care of the child, and Raymond's going to be a good dad, even if it is probably a Dondarrion. So there you go. That was kind of satisfying. We were waiting for the mother to appear. So that was the seven. They were all there. And then we had some other cool archetypes manifest, such as The brothers fighting, that was everywhere in the story. The Fossaway cousins, they count. They're fighting, obviously, by the end of the story. We have a new branch of the Fossaway house started, the Green Apple Fossaways. Then we had Baelor and Maekar, who are actually brothers, and obviously their disagreement was a major part of the story, with them actually coming to blows, and obviously Maekar accidentally killing Baelor. Then we had the Arion and Egg bitterness, so again, brothers fighting. And all of this is taking place in the shadow of the Blackfire Rebellion, which started as Targaryen brothers fighting. Then we had the sort of predatory High Lord archetype, which also doubles with the smog dragon living on the hill and oppressing the townspeople. Manfred Dondarrion was an example, an early example of the haughty, entitled High Lord who couldn't give a shit about the commoners. And then Arion is the ultimate example of a predatory dragon who feeds on the common people and considers himself to be above everyone. Now, Game of Thrones did also have archetypes and symbols, but mostly because they were already in George Martin's writing to begin with. They didn't really seem conscious of them or seem to make good use of them. And then when they invented their own symbols, like the markings on the caves in the Children of the Forest caves on Dragonstone, or those bloody White Walker spirals, those symbols didn't really appear to mean anything, apart from they looked really cool. Now, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, on the other hand, is very conscious of the way that George is using archetypes and symbols, and you can tell that by the way they enhanced and built upon them. You know, turning Robin Risling into the warrior himself based on his backstory and giving him this speech about battlefield madness. That's a great example. And so is the way they fleshed out the Penny Tree legend. All the pennies on the trees represent people who went to war and didn't come back. So it's a tree that stores dead people inside of it. It's a non-magical parallel to what the magical weirwood trees are also doing in the story. They are a memory of the dead, if you will. And so there you have it, folks. I thought this season was great. I'm very excited to see more seasons. I'm excited that George has decided to hand over these outlines to the show. And I really hope this works. I hope they keep doing it. And I hope we get all the way to Summerhall, find out what the hell happened. And speaking of the Summerhall video, I will just real quickly say welcome to everyone who has found the channel recently. Thank you very much. A lot of people coming in through the Summerhall video or the Blackfire Rebellion video or the Ashai video. If you like that kind of thing, then be welcome. Check out the playlist tab on the YouTube channel. There's lots of good stuff in there. So thanks for watching, everyone. And this Sunday, we will be back to our normal 3 p.m. Pacific start time. And we're going to talk a little House of the Dragon. So I'll see you then.